Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know there's still some people trying to join, and if you're just coming in, if you would please mute your mics, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, thank you for being with us this afternoon. My name is Robert Rico. I am the Restorative Justice Coordinator for the Office of Inclusive Excellence at UTSA. And again, welcome. Before we get started, I would like to kind of set the stage by reading acknowledging that we do.
Oh, hey, Professor Rico, you muted. Sorry, sir. There you go.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Robert Rico, and I am the Restorative Justice Coordinator for the
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened with that one. Sorry, y'all. Once again, my apologies, y'all. I'm sorry, I was trying to admit somebody into the room, hit the wrong button. My apologies. I won't do that again. Sorry.
I'm glad that, because I'm not the expert at the Zoom stuff, so I'm glad that somebody's here to help me out, though. So I guess as people are coming in, it's muting me out somehow.
No, that was just I hit the buttons were really close to each other, and I accidentally hit mute instead of admit. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll get through this. All right. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Again, I would like to sort of, again, before we get started, acknowledge that we live and work on indigenous lands. Moreover, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Carrizo and Comacrudo, Cuichilitican, Tacado, Tukawa, Comanche, Lipan Apache, Alabama Coshada, Kickapoo, Tigua Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. Also, I would like to, before again, this kind of to set the stage again for our conversation today, is we have, and I'll introduce the speaker in a moment, but Cheryl Wilson will be speaking about restorative justice practices and anti-racism today. And so as we go into that conversation, again, I would kind of like to set the stage so we can sort of have a respectful dialogue moving forward. So again, I would like to read a poem called Different and Belonging by Annie DeFranco, and it goes like this. I was 4 years old. They tried to test my IQ. When they showed me this picture of 3 oranges in a pear, they asked me which one is different and does not belong. They taught me different was wrong. Okay, so the purpose of our presentation today is again to discuss restorative justice practices and anti-racism work. Cheryl Wilson is a restorative justice practitioner and a trainer, and she's been doing this for many, many years. She'll be discussing the racial reckoning that occurred in 2020 and its impact. She will use the lens of restorative justice to discuss how to dismantle white supremacy and explore the action steps to take forward toward transformation. She'll also touch on and explore the intersectionality of racial justice and restorative justice. So again, we asked it at the end. We hold questions to the end, either by chat, or you can also, we can use it verbally as well. So I ask that you offer your authentic presence. And again, we just hold on to the questions until the end. Send the questions on the chat to Vince Perez, and he will read them for me. Now, I would like to introduce Cheryl Wilson. Cheryl and I go way back many years in doing restorative work. And so I consider her a dear friend and colleague as well. We've been, again, we've known each other for many years. So I can, read Cheryl's done a lot of things. She's done a lot of work in restorative practices in other areas as well. So I can read off a very lengthy bio, but I think that, so I think we want to get to Cheryl's presentation. So I'll just say that currently she is the director of the Kansas City Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. She's also the president of the National Association of Community Restorative Justice. So, so Cheryl, welcome and thank you for being here with us today. I think that we have seen increase in a lot of racism and horrible acts towards certain people and groups in this country in the last few years. And so, and as a restorative justice practitioner myself, I wonder, how can we, what is it that we can do to be a part of the solution to that, or help people talk about this issue that's going on. So but I again, and I, in your book, Cheryl, so she wrote a chapter in a book titled Colorizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities, and her chapter is entitled Calling Out Whiteness. And so what she's going to sort of speak to today is, as a Black woman practicing restorative justice practices in a very a lot of practitioners in restorative justice are tend to be white, and so we're in this space of how can we her struggles or challenges or things that she's experienced personally as a practitioner and RJ in that space. And so Cheryl, I guess it's how do we integrate restorative justice or racial justice and restorative justice?
Well, I definitely plan to talk about that. And there are going to be a lot of ways that I will address that in talking about my book chapter. But before I do that, I just must say, I'm seeing all these names of people who are dear to my heart, and I just want to give out some love to a lot of the folks that I see. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I know many of you, it is part of your work day or your school day, and I'm grateful. So in having that conversation, I want to give some background. First of all, before I do that, I just want to, say that these are conversations where many of the things that I will share this is my point of view. I know there are people who are experts, who have ways of doing this as part of their work and study. There is definitely the discipline of understanding race, understanding white supremacy, all of those things. Part of what I do is talk about this from my lived experience as a Black woman in the United States, having been a daughter of the Deep South. I'm from Tallahassee, Florida originally. So for those of you who want context about who I am, I grew up in a place where it was very integrated, and living all around the country in different places, not always experiencing that. I began to have ways of moving through the world where I found myself in predominantly white spaces, especially throughout my educational journey and throughout my career in different places. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about has to do with my lived experience. And so some of the ways that I define things, some of the ways that things were sitting with me when I wrote my chapter, I've evolved since that time. And so some of that may be a little different, but I hope you will lean in. And I hope that in this is a dialogue. This is not me just giving you a bunch of information, but this is me sharing about my lived experience, and I want to hear more about yours. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and let's get to it. So I want to talk a little bit before I start about how this lecture came to be, and it's the little lecture that could. um, Rob approached me last summer um, about the possibility of coming to speak with his class, and then it kind of grew to more of the UT community. I'm so grateful for people who are colleagues of mine from the UT community who are also on this call. So thank you for showing up, Michael Gilbert, Marilyn Armour. I see you. So what I was approached about was just having this conversation, having recently written my chapter, and the book had come out in the summer. And so we were planning on what, October last fall. And I'll just say, due to some of the challenges that many people who are people who talk about anti-racism, white supremacy, there was a presidential order that prevented some of the ways that we have these conversations in public spaces, especially connected to government, that prohibited some of the ways that I would have spoken about these things then. And we just decided, as a result of some of the ways that some of the challenges were being produced, we canceled. And I think we just had another scheduling thing in the early part of the year, had to cancel again, but now we're here. But I did say to Rob, why don't we wait until the new administration comes in before we attempt to do this? And never had I ever paid attention to executive orders like I had paid attention this time. So I'm telling you, I watched the inauguration, I watched the parade, I watched all of the pomp and circumstance until President Biden sat at that desk and he signed off on the executive orders. And when I heard that a lot of the things that were basically oppressing people from having these conversations like this, I got excited and I said, we're back in business. So it's amazing. All of a sudden, now we know that this is a thing. So anyway, I'm just grateful that we can do this freely. So thinking about what we're talking about in terms of restorative justice. In the background, my background is very solidly steeped in restorative justice. And I'm going to talk a lot about what it is, but probably more of an advanced kind of way. But I want to say, just in the most basic way, restorative justice is how we might look at how to repair harm in the aftermath of crime or wrongdoing in a holistic way. And so when we think about that, we might think about the ways that, some of us come to handle situations in the ways that we were taught growing up. It might be just that simple. If you do something wrong, you're told to apologize. If you break something, you figure out how to fix it for that person, or you figure out how to handle the situation that you have wronged in a circumstance. It's something that has indigenous roots in the ways that we think about this as a practice. And I'm grateful, Rob, for you giving the land acknowledgement that you did, because we should never forget that for many of us who do this work, a lot of it comes from indigenous communities. Native Americans have been doing what we call circle practice, circle process, in ways that they lent that to us as people who do this in community. But it is not ours to co-opt. And so just always being mindful and paying homage to our indigenous communities is so important. So thinking about what this is in terms of this book, you know, Rob talked about the book. Um, so I am so fortunate and grateful to have had an opportunity to be part of a cohort of folks, wonderful folks around the country, around the world, who have contributed to colorizing restorative justice. And so, as I mentioned, I'll be talking about this probably on a more elevated level, because what happened is when we talk about, you know, Rob kind of gave a little context to this, a lot of what restorative justice looked like, especially when I started doing the work and even before practicing, just as a student, trying to understand more about what it is. A lot of the people who were doing the work and doing the presentations, doing the trainings were white people. And there's nothing wrong with that in the grand scheme of things. But if you think about how people show up in community and who they are connecting with and the people they are serving, a lot of those folks are communities of color. And so not having faces of people who look like them is just not it's just not a way to do this if we're thinking about what being restorative is. Do no harm is one of the things that we talk about as practitioners. It's one of the values that we live by. And so sometimes thinking about who gets to provide services, who gets to do this, is something that we want to think about in terms of the faces that show up. And the people who are in those communities often want people who are from their own. And so in that, as people who have been doing this work, many of these folks who wrote chapters in this book have had a similar trajectory of being one of a few people of color in their areas doing the work. So we are grateful for Living Justice Press providing us a platform for to voicing our realities, as the book says. And in my situation, as I said, looking at what it was like to be in predominantly white spaces was something that had been my lived experience as I was in different places around the country. I came to Minnesota many, many years ago and lived in the Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area for about 17 years. And one of the things I remember is how white the communities were that I was in. Now, I will say in the metro areas, the city of St. Paul, the city of Minneapolis, they are very diverse cities. They became more diverse as time went on when I was there. But I remember being a student at the University of Minnesota and being the only African American in my class several times. I remember in the jobs that I had, same thing. And so becoming a practitioner and learning more about restorative justice, what I found was as I was doing this work as a practitioner, people were seeing my name. I have probably a generic name for, you know, people can't quite tell who's going to come in with my name, but many people thought I was white. They spoke to me on the phone. Many people thought I was white. And then I would show up as this, and I would get a different response. But thankfully, many of my experiences, I was able to prove that I could do the work. I could be trusted. I could build communities. And that was the cool thing about this work, is it's transformative in that way. Even when people meet you and they don't know what to make of you, There are ways that doing this work produces a sense of community and a sense of connection that maybe in other fields I had, and I know for sure I had not experienced that. Um, so when this book came out, it was the summer of 2020. Now I'm going to say we wrote these chapters and we were probably done sometime early in 2019, somewhere in there, but we were hoping the book was going to come out with the publishing. And some of you have published things, so you know it takes a while. And so we could not predict when that time would be, but we had finally heard word that it would probably be the summer of 2020. So everybody, all of us who were authors of chapters were very excited. Now, it was supposed to come out in June. Well, what happens in May is the most horrific thing that I couldn't have imagined. But when George Floyd was murdered at the end of May, we were just, and I said it then, we were cracked open as a country, trying to figure out why and how did this happen. And I remember getting the first copies of the book around that time, kind of a bittersweet kind of way, because I had spent the previous week just weeping. I remember watching the news on the day that they showed that footage, and I had actually found that 8 minutes and 46 seconds somewhere on YouTube or on a Facebook feed. I can't remember, but it wasn't something they were showing on TV. And I made myself watch it. I made myself watch it. I probably shouldn't have, but I was sitting in a room alone and I couldn't stop weeping. And my husband had to come and console me because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And that this was 2020 and a man was putting his knee on the neck. A white man was putting his knee on the neck of a black man, a man who was entrusted to serve and protect, was putting his knee on the neck of a black man. And I will say a defenseless black man, because we found out later that there were other officers holding him down. So there was nowhere for this man to go. And then as he lost his life, they picked his body up and they just threw it on the gurney like a piece of trash. And then off like it was another day at the office. If you watch that in full, you will see what I'm talking about. And I told people you should watch this, not because of the sensational ways that it was out there, but because of the ways that I think about Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, a young man who was brutally lynched, brutally beaten. And his mother, when she received his body for burial, told the funeral director to leave the coffin open because she wanted the world to see what they did to her baby. And so thinking about that, I wanted the world to see what was done to George Floyd. It is important that we not forget that. And even as we are approaching the 1-year anniversary of that date, we should not ever forget that. So when our book came out, the world was cracked open, and there were many people seeking answers. There were many people who were hearing things like they had never heard them about becoming anti-racist. Like how does one do that? Especially, I'm talking to white people. I'm talking about white people. White people who I probably could not have engaged in a conversation about anti-racism in a real way were approaching me for the first time. or many white people were approaching their friends of color about how do I do this, or how do I do better? How can I be better? So this book resonated with people in ways when even people who didn't understand what restorative justice is, they were looking at this book like, wow, the concepts and the ideas that are discussed in this book jumped off the page for a lot of folks. So we're grateful for the love that we got about this book, and for the ways that people are still leaning in, wanting to know more, and understanding it's not just about practitioners of color, but it is about our lived experiences as people of color in this world, navigating in a field that should be embracing who we are. Because we know, even though there are people who will have you believe or make you think, if you are, especially if you're in the United States, that being white is the dominant culture. We know for sure, as people of color in the world, we are the majority. And so, in that, we need to live into that. And that's what this book is kind of forcing the field to do, but forcing the world as well. And so I have great appreciation for what this book will do, and what it has done already, and what it will continue to do in our communities. When I talk about my chapter, I think about how we talked about, I gave that really basic definition of restorative justice. But in reality, we need to expand the definition. So let's talk about, the basics of what it is. But if we think about, if I use that word holistic, which is what I use a lot, the word holistic to me means it's open. It means it's a there are possibilities around what a holistic process looks like. And so Fania Davis, who is a well-known one of our brightest and best in the field, talks about her definition. One of the ways she describes restorative justice is, she says, nothing about us without us is a central tenet of restorative justice. In an ongoing, radically respectful and inclusive process, we must do the work ourselves. This means in every neighborhood and on every block, every day people roll up their sleeves and do the challenging and hopeful work of engendering transformed relationships and structures leading into new futures. And so this way that we think about how restorative justice needed to expand and become something that encompasses everyone. Nothing about us without us. I love that, because many, as I said before, many of the people who are doing restorative justice work are serving in communities of color. And so the idea that the people who are doing that should be of their own communities, should be people like them, coming from similar trajectories, that's just what is right. And that is the best way that we can do no more harm. So I want to talk about navigating white spaces. One of the things that I have known and felt, and even recently, is what I'm paying more attention to, what I am feeling, how, even just how my body responds to being in predominantly white spaces. I remember this was just a few days ago. I actually was doing a call. I was on a Zoom call. I wasn't presenting, but I was, I was, in a way, I was presenting. Um, but what was interesting was I came on with all of the people before the call started. We did all of our prep, talked, had our little pre-conversation. Now, I will say all of those folks were white. What was interesting to me, and I do this, and a lot of people of color do this too. We look in rooms, in spaces to see who's showing up. Is there anybody in there like me? And so I remember watching on the screen. It was like one, you know, five more white people came in. Then there were five or 10, 20, 30. I think there was maybe 40 white people on there. And then I could count maybe 5 people of color. Now I can't be certain. You know, we don't know how people, um, are um, naming themselves, but I'm saying that for me, just seeing the sea of white faces, in some ways, I started to pay attention to how it made me feel. And I just have to say, I think that what people don't always understand is when a person of color is in a predominantly white space, and I'll say this is my lived experience, so maybe this doesn't happen to everybody else, but I have a certain level of anxiety about it. And so what I had been having this conversation, I've done a few of these lectures, and so I get a little further along in the discussion every time, but I have said this a few other times where it's like having that feeling that you have when you're at a job interview. You know how that goes for many of you who've done interview after interview. You know every word is going to be scrutinized. You know your body movement, what you're wearing, everything is going to be highly scrutinized. And so the idea that you have a misstep or you don't represent yourself well is a big deal. And if you're a person of color, and I'll say for me as a Black woman, I often have that feeling that I have to be good. I have to be better. I have to be best because I am not just there for me. I'm there for every person that comes after me, and I don't want to let down the people that came before me. And so the idea that I make a misstep is in my head often to do my to do my best. And when I don't do my best, I feel that reflects on not just me. So for many people of color who only connect with other people that they are in a workspace with or educational setting or community setting, and it's all white, that is sometimes some of the most challenging ways that a person can exist consistently, not when you get to check in and check out, but if that is all your experiences are, it can be nerve-wracking. And if you think about this, if you're white, if you think about ways that you have been out of your depth because you have been surrounded by people of color consistently, there are ways that that feels uncomfortable. And so that discomfort is what many people of color, it's our lived experience all the time. And so I say this in the ways that I want to encourage people to think about that, um, think about that in the long term of how you um, how you think about spaces, how you think about where you go, what power and privilege you have, or what privilege and power you don't have. I want to just read a small section out of my chapter. And I talk about this idea of calling out whiteness. I felt like for a long time I didn't have a voice. I couldn't name what it was, that this anxiety, all the ways that I was kind of not dealing. And as I've gotten older, I've started to understand it doesn't have to stay that way. And frankly, I'm appalled sometimes at how there are places where we still, and I say we, I mean people of color, I mean Black people, from my where I sit, I am still appalled. That there are places where the landscape is so lily white. There is just no, like why? How is that possible? And I just I've started to be more emboldened in this time. And I wrote, um, over the years, I have become more emboldened to call out whiteness and white privilege in many settings, most especially in the spaces where I am working as a practitioner of restorative justice. By saying that I call out whiteness, I mean that I inform those who are in power or leadership that um, as a person of color, I recognize that the creation of predominantly white work settings is a form of white supremacy, and I ask them to recognize it as well. And so many times I was not cognizant of how to do that, but I've become a more aware. I felt more support to do that. And I deal with the uncomfortableness, the uncomfortability of knowing that I'm not everybody's friend when I do that. And sometimes I have not had the most kind words. Um, and I don't make the white people in the room feel comfortable. And I know that. And I'm starting to be okay about that. And it's kind of been my way of releasing that anxiety. And so in that, I'm asking not only that I be the one to notice it, but as white people, I'm asking you, if that's who you are, to notice it too. When you go on a Zoom call, just look, pay attention. When you go to spaces, especially places where there are people who have to choose, you know, or places, I'll say places that you have to choose, but then think about places where you don't have the ability to choose and you have to show up, and this is what it is. I I offer in my book ways to think about what it would look like, because I feel like what the the ways that I have come into this work, I feel like and I tell people often that restorative justice is not just what I do. It's not just something I learned how to do steps and I figured it out and I'm good at it. It's what I feel like I'm called to do. And I think when you have a calling, you approach it very differently because it is something that comes from your very core. And so for me, the only way that I can see how the ways that the work has come to me and the things that I know to be true about changing the landscape of how we allow or don't allow things to continue, especially in thinking about predominantly white spaces. I feel like the work is what makes the application. It's the way, it's the portal that we should use in order to make those changes, to dismantle white spaces. And so thinking about the work, I think about how restorative justice helps me to know and remember that process matters. And so the ways that we can do this restoratively, these are some things that I think about that get us there. First of all, we need to name the situation, whether it be, like I said, in a workplace, in a school setting, in a community setting, whether it be for us. Sometimes we don't do things because they don't impact us. And I think that's the saddest thing. But if there's somebody in your community and you know that this isn't right, it's not necessarily serving those folks in the ways that it should, because it's a predominantly white, white led, I'll say, and there are people of color who are not in those in those positions of power in order to have a greater impact. I think that we have to name it. One of the things that I've been talking about a lot lately is in being in those situations where you do have people of color who can help in those situations. We think of them as people who, a lot of times we hear the diversity hire, the diversity choices, and there's one or two, and those people get burnt out. But if we are naming that these situations are predominantly white, then we are thinking of ways to fully bring in people of color in large numbers, not one or two. I would say the other thing that is important is education. And what I mean by education is that we learn what this is. We learn how to shift white supremacy means that you learn how to think about what it is. How whiteness is something that isn't about a white person in as much as it is an ideology, in ways that the privilege and the power, the ways that whiteness is so prevalent in the things that we do, the ways that we do things, the ways that we don't do things. And so thinking about how can we learn more? How can we learn to be anti-racist? And I would say at a baseline, anti-racism training is something that has blown up over the year. If you couldn't find an anti-racism training last year, you can certainly find one. And I mean, you can almost let your fingers do the walking. There's so many people who are offering anti-racism training in this country. I think as a baseline, everybody, that should be like some of the 101 stuff that we should be required to do on our jobs. It should be the 101 things that we should be required to do as I think about working on a college campus, that we have our students engage in anti-racism training, faculty, everyone should have that as a baseline. Now, does that mean that we are cured? Absolutely not. But I think it's a baseline to give people vocabulary. It gives the opportunity to name what is. It gives people the opportunity to understand where they sit in terms of a spectrum of how they need to make the shift toward becoming anti-racist. And a lot of times people think a certain way about where they're at and they're delusional. And it's wonderful to have that as a way of just giving that baseline. I talked a lot about having people of color in situations where they, when I think about being a part of a group, being a part of a task force, people of color are filters for people who are white, who would often gather and come up with. I think there are a lot of well-intentioned white people who do great work, and they do it as a collective without connecting with people of color. And that is a tragedy because often projects fail. Like there are a lot of people who do things and they wonder, why didn't that project do well in this community? And a person of color could tell you, you didn't ask me. You didn't want to know what I thought. You need, as white people, you need a person of color to be a filter in ways that we can validate, or we can tell you it's not going to work, or we can tell you who you need to connect with. We're gatekeepers in a lot of ways that white people are for us. We've just been paying attention. The assembly and participation of diverse groups of people. I just mentioned just the ways that we bring people together. And when you have groups that are, when I say the task force, a lot of times I get called to be on that task force when the task force has met a few times and they made a lot of decisions and they just need me as window dressing because I'm the diversity choice, right? So I'm saying, when you start that task force, especially if you are a white person, you need to be thinking about how you can bring in other people and not just, and I use that word diverse, and I understand diverse can mean a lot and it cannot mean a lot. I would say, as a colleague and good friend of mine has been helping, we've been having these conversations about not just people who embrace diversity, but people who embrace culture. And when I say that, I mean, we do not have to look at how people need to be the same and be on the same page on every single thing. Yes, there are times when we are working together, we need to find common ground. But in finding common ground, we are not trying to tell people to assimilate. And I think that's part of the whiteness that I spoke about. Just this idea that everything has got to be the same. Everybody's got to have the same goals. And what success looks like this. I want to, when I think about what culture, just understanding culture, is that in knowing that someone else has a different trajectory, has a different way of defining some of the things that might be good or successful or right, might be very different from me, and that I can respect that and in sometimes agree to disagree, and we can continue to move forward. That's what you need to have in the ways of people coming together. And the commitment to process, I think, is something that when I say that process matters, I think about how we participate in different restorative practices. When I talk about this, I'm often reminded, and one of the most widely used practices is in using circle practice, circle process. When we sit in circle, we're able to have people come as their authentic selves. And a lot of times when we're back in physical space together, we can sit in circle. We've been able to do this virtually as well in this time of being sheltered in. But what has been great is the idea that we have people who come together in circle. We use a talking piece to guide the conversation. Whoever has the talking piece has the floor. As that talking piece is passed around the room, everyone gets to share as how, in whatever ways feels right to them, without the judgment, without the interruption of someone else in the circle until it is their turn to share. And everyone is treated equally. And the person who is facilitating, the circle keeper, is a full participant. And so if you can imagine sitting in circle, having conversations around all of the topics that can confound us, that we can be even the most hot button topics, having conversations in circle, the process of doing that can enhance the ways that we think about how we can get along in community, how we can be anti-racist. And lastly, I think about partnering with accomplices. So I want to talk about this because I want to say something about how we have, I think for many white folks who have become enlightened over the past year. Now, clearly, there are a whole slew of you, and I'm probably talking to the choir. There are a whole slew of you white folks who are on this call right now who are probably already evolved. You've taken anti-racism training. You've been in the trenches with your friends of color. I'm not talking to you in that sense, but I am talking to you in the ways of not. I beg of you to not stay in that space of being comfortable as an ally. I think allies are great. I have nothing against being an ally. I think a lot of people have become allies of people of color over this past year. But I will tell you, the thing that I get concerned about is people who get comfortable in doing that allyship. And sometimes there's this way that they don't continue to follow through, or that they drop the banner, or it becomes too difficult, or it becomes wearying. I've thought about this and I said, I know there's a thing called racial battle fatigue. It is real. I have experienced it, especially over the past year. But there is not such a thing as ally battle fatigue. But for some, maybe it feels wearying to you to hold up that banner of anti-racism as a white person. I say that with the ways that you continue to do the work, the hope is that you will strive to be an accomplice. And what I mean by that is you continue to do the work. You continue, and for everyone who is engaging in anti-racism work, I wish I could give you a formula. I wish I could tell you, you're going to read 3 books on anti-racism. You're going to go watch a couple of movies that talk about race relations, and you're going to go help a few people in your community as people of color to help them in whatever ways that you can. And then you will truly be anti-racist and you will get your badge. But we know that that doesn't happen. And there is no point of arrival. And for every person who is engaging in anti-racism work in whatever ways that you are in your community and their places of work, there is a different spectrum for everyone in terms of how you get there. And I wish I could tell you what that is. I'm kind of glad that I can't, because I think it's important for everyone to struggle toward that goal for yourself. There is no one right way, as one of my colleagues said, there's no one right way to do anti-racism work, but the important thing is that you stay in it. So being an accomplice to me means that you are lockstep with your friends of color who are engaging in ways every day, navigating, trying to figure it out. And sometimes they come upon roadblocks. And I know after the murder of George Floyd, I know that um, I know that it was hard for a lot of white folks to figure out what to do, how to fix it. And I'm not saying that that was necessarily the attitude, but there are ways that, and I'll say this for many Black people, we all got checked on in that time by our white friends. And not to say that that was a bad thing, but some people were checked on in ways that the white person that they were getting checked on by was not somebody that was necessarily in their lives and that they were in relationship with. And it became a thing. And what I'm saying is, if I was already in relationship with you and you're checking in on me as my friend, as my colleague, I welcomed it. But some people who I just like, oh, okay. Yeah, that felt weird. And I'll just say that. But just the idea that we take it to the level of really connecting beyond allyship and continuing to go deeper in our practice of anti-racism in whatever ways you know you struggle through to get to. But there are a lot of ways that you can do that constructively if you are in good relationship with folks in your community, especially people of color. So I want to talk about the commitment to doing the work is important. It's imperative. I think about it like, you know, you for the things that you are connecting with in community, for people who are like me, I think about the ways that when I go out, when I go do things publicly, I sometimes come home and I want to just let it all go. I don't get to do that. I don't get to make those choices. This doesn't come off. This is part of me. This chocolate right here, it doesn't go anywhere. For many white folks, I just encourage you to think about not growing weary, not giving up, and not saying this task force, we can get to that agenda item next week. It'll be there. We can handle this process. This will go on next budget year. Or I'm not going to get with that person today because I just can't find any more time in my schedule. For people of color, the things that we need and the things that we want, the things that we hope for, is urgent like nothing else. And so when people who are our white allies, and I'm using that word in air quotes for a reason, because I think you show yourself when you don't show up. You show who you are. So the whole idea is if you're lockstep with me, then that agenda item will not wait. That budget year, you'll figure it out. We'll find it. We'll find that money this budget year. We will do this initiative now because the community needs it. My community needs it. I will feel safer. I will feel more connected. That's the way that you are being an accomplice. I'm going to ask you a question about that as white folks and the ways that the work comes to you. I think about that way of being tired. And you come, I will ask when you go home and you are done with whatever you're working on, do you think about the ways that the people of color in your community are not thriving or have needs, or the people you know that are feeling things that are happening, like the situations that have confounded us since the murder and before the murder of George Floyd? Because George Floyd was the most horrific, I would say, in modern times. But this is not something new. But are those things you grapple with and think about and wrestle with and lose sleep at night? Are you tired? Do you feel like you need a break? And I just want to ask, are you tired? Are you tired like Rosa Parks when she was asked to give up her seat off of the bus? Are you tired like Malcolm X when he knew that his days were numbered and people were calling and he was knowing that his number was up? Are you tired like Martin Luther King when he said, I have been to the mountaintop and I may not get there with you, but one day we will get there as a people? Are you tired like Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired when it came to voting rights? I ask you to do the work, to stay connected. This is all part of the ever evolving conversations I've been having in this time. I encourage you to consider how there are ways that you can apply what is learned from becoming more knowledgeable about restorative justice. I think about the ways that we are called in this time to be anti-racist like no other time in our modern times. I am grateful to have had this opportunity to share just a little bit of what's been on my mind. I thank you for engaging me. I look forward to hearing from you in this next iteration of hearing the things that you would like to ask me and ways that I can hear from you. So thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate our collegial relationship and our friendship, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing your story with us. It's so powerful. It's restorative work. Just real quick, what it's done for me is has made me a better listener, but not just a better listener, but listening from the heart. Right, that's where you truly, and it's that like you said, it's that calling. And so I think that's one of the things that it does is it makes you listen from the heart. That's very, very different than just taking notes. So at this time, I'm going to open it up for questions on the chat, or if you want to do it verbally, that's okay as well. So we'll open it up for questions. And I believe you need to send me a text if you want me to unmute you. Or here's a question, we got one. Okay, the question is, how do you work with different communities of color, such as AAPI, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, communities whose voice and experiences have traditionally been ignored in anti-racism work, narratives in restorative justice? Experiences of people of color are not all the same. How do you recognize and validate these differences in restorative justice work and move beyond the Black-white framework?
I have I definitely, as I said at the beginning of my lecture, these are reflections from my lived experience. And so I so most certainly believe that there is an uneven way that we, as people of color, as as people who come from many different backgrounds and experiences, I think that there are ways that restorative justice work has to be something that we, as I said before, the definition of restorative justice needs to be expanded to include all and the lived experiences of all. And so in my mind, I am sharing in ways that I am hoping that I can embrace and understand more about the lived experience of the lived experiences of people in the Asian and Pacific Islander community. So thank you for bringing that up. And I absolutely agree that it hasn't been even, and and maybe there, for the purposes of understanding this work and the communities that have been served, there may be folks who are from the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities that feel disenfranchised as a result of not being seen. In recent weeks, given the murders of those in the Atlanta area, just most recently in the mass shooting, as a result of that, we, as NACRJ, held a virtual circle process about 2 or 3 weeks ago that addressed harms that we wanted to name in these communities. And I invite you also to go to our Facebook page. There's a video of our speaker and addressing some of that and hearing from some of our folks in the community. But at the end of the day, I implore you to, if there's a way that I can amplify your voice in talking about that, I welcome it. And I would even welcome an offline conversation that goes deeper to support whatever I can do. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. You can also use the raise hand reaction on the chat if you, or on your screen there. So if you want to ask a question. And Vince, if you can.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi.
Hi, I just wanted to tell you thank you, and to also just tell you that, your discussion about the fatigue and exhaustion that our colleagues and friends of color suffer. I'm a white woman, been doing DEI work in medical education for about a decade now. And sometimes I do get tired, but then honestly, all I have to do is I just think to myself, my tired is nothing compared to the tired that people of color feel. I don't get microaggressions multiple times a day and macroaggressions multiple times a day. The other thing too, I know my privilege as a white person, if I get too tired of doing DEI work, I really could just walk away and leave it behind. I would never do that because I am invested and I'm an ally, I think a strong ally, particularly to my students of color. So I would never be able to walk away in good conscience. I'm like you, this is a mission and a calling for me, but I just wanted to acknowledge your tiredness and tell you that, I see you, I stand with you. Thank you for the work you're doing around restorative justice and reconciliation. Super important. And I learned a lot today from you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. And I do, I do think about this way that we, I applaud the work of many of you. I believe today I'm probably speaking, as I said earlier, to the chorus. But I just want everyone to consider how, I appreciate what you're saying about knowing your privilege, and in some ways you're checking yourself.
Yeah.
I think that's highly important. And I do it myself. I do my own like self-work around, I think about it in relationship to my ancestors.
Mhm.
I don't have the right to be upset when I think about the things that my mother and father went through, and my grandparents and their parents before them. I stand on their shoulders.
Yeah.
I didn't have some of the things happen to me that happened to them. And I wouldn't be the person I am today without the ways that they raised me. They raised me to be free.
Yeah.
And I don't take that for granted one day. So I do the same self-work. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, we have a question from Todd in the chat. He says, I respectfully understand your story, path and work. However, as a Black man, what is your ask now? What do you think will assist Blacks in moving closer to equal in America?
I think in terms of what my ask is in terms of what we, and I say Black people, my hope is that we would feel, and I use the word empowered because it's what comes straight to mind, but we would feel empowered in ways to challenge the white systems that confound us. I think there are a lot of ways that I've shared this, thinking about the ways that when doors are shut and white people walk in, they kick down the door. I think that in the same ways, we should feel that same privilege to walk in those doors and demand that these systems not make decisions in ways that impact us and we not have a seat at the table. And so when I talked about Fania Davis and that whole idea of nothing for us without us, I mean, those are ways that we call out whiteness. Those are ways that we make the demand that this is not the way that we can continue to exist. And I think if we get shut down, that we go public in ways that we don't just let it rest. So that would be my ask when I think about the ways that we call out whiteness.
Thank you. We have another in the chat. Susan says, what thoughts do you have regarding restorative justice in the justice system? As you know, Black and brown people are overrepresented in every part of the judicial system. New laws are being introduced in many areas requiring more police accountability, more anti-bias training, etc. And that it says the one here has just been amended to water down this bill in New England or I think that's what it says, or initials for. I wrote on this bill commending the original language and opposing the amendments.
I think just in general, my thoughts in terms of the justice system is, well, first of all, let me just say, the justice system in and of itself is harmful in the ways that a person gets incarcerated, a person gets into a system who is possibly continue to be marginalized, and the court systems that one goes through is extremely punitive, harmful, all the things that I talked about in terms of if there's an overrepresentation of people who are going through the system, there's an overrepresentation of people who are making those decisions on the flip side in the white community that impact us. My hope is that there are ways that we can find restorative solutions, because restorative solutions may not even require that portal. That would mean that maybe someone who is potentially has to go to jail for something may not even go to jail. That may mean that a person who might stand before a judge for something might not have to do that because of the type of harm or the type of crime that it was, or the type of ways that the situation came to be, is not something that it requires it. There are so many people of color who are in prison today for non-violent crimes and serving long sentences for it. And we've seen this play out in the ways that we've talked about the drug culture and the drug community, in the ways that white people are leading into getting help and healing for the opioid crisis. But when it was crack, Black people were going to jail. People of color in general were going to jail and serving long sentences. And so the idea that we are not looking at systems that look at the crime itself and thinking of ways that we can repair harm by making it even all the way around, that nobody should go to jail for nonviolent harm, in the ways that there are alternatives. There are ways that people who have addictions can get help, period. Why are they being incarcerated? And so there are many, I could go on and on around the criminal justice system and the ways that there are restorative solutions, even for severe and violent harm. Not to say that there isn't some punishment that may have to happen. And I say punishment in the sense that there may have to be something that someone has to serve time if they take a life. But even in that, there are ways to do time. There are ways that systems can work to not be as harmful, as visceral as they are, even in the most violent, horrible situations that I've actually worked with folks who have repaired harm and who have made amends in their communities due to the ways that restorative solutions have been offered. Nothing is perfect and nothing is a panacea. And I am not here to say restorative justice is the perfect way. I'm saying it's a better way. But there are many ways that restorative justice is working currently in ways that we are already doing good work. It's just not being done in massive ways. But there's a lot of great. I get the opportunity as the president of NACRJ to see great work being done all around the country in the ways of how it's helping the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Cheryl. I just want a quick comment on that. I am part of a committee that is working on introducing restorative justice practices for law enforcement on a national level. So we are starting to see some work being done for policing in restorative work. So that is, we're working on that right now. So also the juvenile justice system sort of mirrors the adult system, right? The same thing happens there. So that's another area that needs to be, I think, some changes.
And I've had the privilege of working in both systems, the juvenile system and the adult system, in different times in my life. And I will just say, there are definitely ways that we can do this better and differently than what we're seeing right now. I know that some of these folks are on this are in of this number on this Zoom call right now. So I'm grateful though to um, to be able to see it in my lifetime. I'm grateful to see a lot of good work happening.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and I see one in the chat. Do you have thoughts about how performative activism plays a role on allyship?
I'm not really sure about the terminology, but I will say that in terms of okay, looks like the hand is raised. Is that your question?
Yes.
Can we
Yes, that's my question.
hi.
Nice to meet you. I really enjoy your talk. For performative activism, so it's something that I've seen and that I try not to fall into, which is basically just posting on social media things to appear as an ally, but you're actually not doing the work of an ally. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about, like, you want to be vocal about things, but you actually want to be doing the work, and that might require not being on social media. So all of that stuff.
Thank you for that. And I'm probably showing my age when I say I didn't know the terminology.
No, no
So
worries.
I'm of a certain age. I am on social media though. But what I was going to say was that I think that that's another way that we call out whiteness, in the sense that I'm assuming that the people who are saying that they're allies are white folks who and maybe well-intentioned white folks. I don't pass judgment necessarily all the time, but what needs to happen, social media is its own beast. I do believe that when there's a difference between calling it out though, and I'll say, and canceling. And I want to be fair to the fact that there are people who, they may be misguided, they may be misinformed. I give people the benefit of the doubt, but I will approach people privately, and then if I'm not getting a response, I kind of make myself known in more public ways. But I think ultimately it's not about canceling that person if there's a way to engage them in real dialogue. And I've had conversations with people that generated, I have a story behind that, in a way that happened around a colleague, a friend of mine, did not like the fact that I voted for a particular person. And I never put my political life on social media. And I didn't actually put anything out there, but I did when my candidate won, I wrote, yes. And that's all I did. And I got the most visceral message back from this person. And I just could have easily have just unfriended, moved on. We don't see each other. We're not in the same city, and lived my life. But I took it as an opportunity. I DM'd her and I said, hey, the reason why I deleted your post, and I just went into my, conversation. And do you know, we actually spoke on the phone the next day. And I wasn't trying to flip her, and she wasn't trying to flip me, but we had what I would consider to be one of the most meaningful conversations that could have ended in a very different way. And what she said on my Facebook page was not nice at all. And I quickly deleted it. But I'm saying this to say, it's uncomfortable, it's hard. It's still about the personal connection we make with each other, and not the public ways that we just put stuff up and it doesn't, it's like we're hiding behind that in some persona that's on social media. We still have to get to the people. And if we sometimes that means we have to do some things that we don't like. Like it would have been really easy for me to just not ever engage and just cancel.
Mhm.
But that is how we're living in this super polarized, ways that we are alienating ourselves from each other. And we need to do more to be in that space of I'm listening, tell me more. We don't have to agree. And I think that confounds some people, that we have to always be thinking the same. No, we don't. But I will respect you if we can just be in our spaces, and you don't have to try to change me. I don't have to try to change you. And I'm not trying to take you down for it. So I think that is, to me, how we get there. It still is doing the work of being connected to each other. There's never going to be a way to change that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheryl, we got about 3 minutes. You think we can squeeze one more question in?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, Dorothy Vandereen asks, what in particular do you think white RJ advocates need to rethink?
Oh, hello, Dorothy. You can unmute if you want. Good to have you here. I think one of the things that for me was super powerful was having the opportunity. A couple of years ago, I got the opportunity to go visit Howard Zehr, who, for many people who may not know who his name, Howard is who we would call one of our elders in restorative justice work. We call him lovingly the grandfather of restorative justice. Howard retired, and when he and I spoke at that time, I talked to him about, his retirement. I talked to him about the ways that he is still connecting and engaged. But he said one of the things that he wanted to do was to stand down in the ways that he knew that people would, and people still continue to call him, to ask him to speak, to ask him to engage in ways around the work. And it's not that he doesn't, he does things, he shows up, I think, to some things, but I think in a lot of ways he's wanting to make space for people of color, knowing that if he stands down, stands back, that maybe those opportunities will go to people of color. And I think in some ways, I say this in my chapter, how whiteness, the ideology of whiteness is greedy. And I say that because I feel like sometimes there are white folks who have been of our community who have taken all the opportunities in a specific area, in a specific, whatever, if it be a community, if it be on a specific platform. I've just seen that happen time and time again, where I have been, and not trying to be in competition with anyone. I would prefer to work in collaboration than in competition. And I think that is part of the challenge in our community, is if we are to do no harm, then the idea of working collaboratively should be part of what everybody should be doing. But I don't always, that hasn't always been my experience. So I'll say it that way.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks for being here, Dorothy.
Cheryl, thank you for being with us this afternoon, spending your time with us. Great conversation. Thank you, all of you, for being here as well and spending time with us. So I would like to close our gathering today by reading, it's called Belonging. And the title of it is We Are Wired to Love, to be Loved, and to Belong. A deep sense of love and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. We are biologically, connectively, physically, and spiritually wired to love. to be loved, and to belong. When those needs are not met, we don't function as we were meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick. Brene Brown. Thank you again, all of y'all, for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Hey, Mike Gilbert.